Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, depending where you are. My name is George Devendorf, and I'm the director of the Disaster Ready Initiative. And I wanted to thank all of you for taking the time to join us for our latest Disaster Ready webinar today. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to say a quick word about the Cornerstone On Demand Foundation and Disaster Ready. If we could go to the next slide, excellent. I think many of you are already familiar with both Cornerstone and Disaster Ready, but those of you who are not, I just wanted to draw your attention to the slide you're looking at now and the goal of this initiative, which is to leverage the expertise and know-how around staff development and staff and human resource management that the Cornerstone Corporation and Foundation brings to help NGOs around the world to do a better job of building, developing, and managing their human resources. And through Disaster Ready, we are presenting cutting-edge e-learning and other resources through a free online portal. I hope many of you have already had a chance to explore that portal, but if you haven't, please feel free to do so at disasterready.org. Can we go to the next slide? The advisory group, which Cornerstone formed to help with the development of Disaster Ready, includes the groups you see here. I think we have representatives from many of these agencies on the line with us today. I'm happy to say that World Vision International has also recently joined, although we've not updated this slide yet. In any event, these are the agencies that have taken tremendous efforts to ensure that Disaster Ready is focused on priority needs and is working in a collaborative way to help fill gaps and to avoid duplication as we try to bring various learning resources onto the portal. Next slide, please. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Amy Hilleboe. I think many of you are probably already familiar with Amy. Through her work at Catholic Relief Services, she's played a leadership role within the Emergency Capacity Building project to advance their efforts around disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. In addition to being a driver within that interagency process, Amy is also one of the 3 co-authors of the Toward Resilience Guide that I hope many of you have had a chance to see before our meeting today on this webinar. In any event, Amy, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, George. Thanks so much to everybody for giving me the opportunity to acquaint you a bit with the Toward Resilience Guide. It does have a nice bright cover, so you may have seen it, and I think it stands out. This is what the cover looks like. Next slide, please. So today I will take some time to tell you a bit about some background information. Many of you probably already have this information, but it's central to how the guide was developed and why the guide was developed in the manner in which it was through a very participatory process. So it's the Hilleboe framework is very much central to the guide. Then I'll tell you a bit about the ECV project for those of you who may not be familiar, the process to develop the guide, and then information about the guide, the 10 principles that run throughout, and the contents, the features, and the annexes. And then we will have some time for Q&A. Next slide, please. The Hilleboe Framework for Action is it's the first plan to explain, describe, and lay out the detail for sectors and actors to reduce disaster losses. There are 5 priorities for action from 2005 to 2015, the time frame for the framework. And that's to ensure that disaster risk reduction is a priority at local and national levels, and that it's strongly integrated in institutions. That we identify, assess, and monitor disaster risks and enhance early warning systems to move people out of harm's way. That we use local knowledge and we tap into innovation and education to build a total culture of safety and resilience. And that's at all levels, in government, communities, in schools, throughout all of our lives. Attempting to work toward reducing the underlying risk factors, a longer-term approach, but something that definitely needs to be done to actually reduce risk in communities. And then strengthening disaster preparedness for effectiveness at all levels. So these are the things that the Hilleboe Framework for Action seeks to achieve. And we're coming up on a time to revise the framework, so there's a lot of discussion about what has been achieved toward these activities and what needs to be strengthened for the next framework. Next slide, please. So the Emergency Capacity Building Project, many of you are familiar with this, but it is a collaborative effort of 6 agencies: CARE International, Catholic Relief Services, Mercy Corps, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision International. And the goal of this 5-year project is to increase coordination and among the humanitarian and development communities, and to improve the quality, speed, and effectiveness within our work. We have 3 areas of focus, and that's to build staff capacity, to strengthen disaster risk reduction, and to strengthen our accountability and impact measurements. This is all the focus of this 5-year project. Next slide, please. So within the project, it's being implemented in 5 country consortia. Oxfam is leading the project in Bolivia, Save the Children in Bangladesh, CRS in Indonesia, CARE in Niger, and World Vision is working with the Horn of Africa and coordinating activities through the Nairobi office, but activities in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Uganda. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the guide. Well, in 4.5 years ago, when the ECB project was launched, each of the country consortia pulled together and developed some concept notes as to what they felt would be the greatest contribution that the ECB project could achieve over the 5-year period. One of the main goals of the project is to test, produce, and collaboratively pull together outputs that will provide, be useful resources for the wider humanitarian and development community. One of the things that was very pronounced in those concept notes was the need for to strengthen disaster risk reduction. And through the information that came from the field, it appeared quite clear that there was a lot of interest in getting a basic understanding of disaster risk reduction, how to implement programs, and the emerging issue of climate change adaptation. The indications were from the field that there's a lot of information out there, but it's difficult for staff to really identify what resources are most useful to them. There's almost too much information. At least that's the message we received. Next slide, please. So, in keeping with the nature of the Emergency Capacity Building Project, it was decided that we would collaboratively prepare a guide to support field staff to design and implement disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation programs, and to particularly focus on the intersection of these 2 program areas. The first step that we took to determine what the guide should look like and what it should include was to do a scoping study with about 27 key actors in the DRR and CCA fields, and to determine, number one, if a guide was really needed, because there are a lot of resources available. 2, if so, to determine what the scope should be, and 3, any particular areas that the guide should focus on where there may be gaps in information. So that was the first step. And then following that, we worked with the 5 field consortia, gathered 2 representatives from each consortia at a conference in Bangkok to get their input on what they, from their perspective at the field level, are the needs. And one of the things we did leading up to that conference was to do a study with them to determine what resources they currently use in their work to design and implement these programs, and where they feel there are gaps, where they're spending a lot of time searching the Internet for information that's really applicable to their work and what they're doing on the ground that isn't terribly scientific but really helps guide their thinking in designing and implementing programs. So with that, next slide, please. We determined the target audience, and this is tricky because each agency has different names, different titles for the people in working staff in the field programs, but generally targeting humanitarian and development fields. It was very important to get the development side in the discussion because many of the DRR perspectives and the DRR people are situated or were formerly situated in humanitarian departments, recognizing that we really do need to get this kind of programming much stronger in development programs. We definitely wanted to focus on field practitioners with practical language and practical information that they would find most useful, mid-level project managers, but also headquarters staff for their own interests, but people developing proposals, meeting with donors, advocacy purposes, etc. So that was the target audience that we defined and that we wanted to be sure that we were using the right language and the right pitch for the contents of the guide. We wanted to also make sure that the language was appropriate for translations, knowing that a previous document prepared by the Emergency Capacity Building Project, the Good Enough Guide, has now been translated into maybe, 10 languages because of its usefulness. So we wanted to be sure that we were developing a product that could be easily translated and easily used by staff that aren't necessarily versed in the technical language of DRR and CCA. In addition to the field practitioners and the ECB DRR advisors contributing to the guide, we had the 2 consultants, the 2 authors, Marlies Turnbull and Charlotte Sterrett. We had a team of external editorial committee bringing levels of expertise to the review process from academics and scientific backgrounds. And then we also had a number of special additional advisors that we included as the guide unfolded, because through the process we did find that there was more information we needed on land use management, for example, and we needed somebody with real expertise in that to help review that section and help develop it so that it was most up to date. So there was quite a team working on the process over this 2 year. It took 2 years to develop the guide, and we kept a library of the comments. In all, I think we reached about 1,700 through the process to track them, group them, look at trends, look at some of the issues that really would call for revisions in the guide. We also, through the process, translated it into, at each point, translated draft 1 into Spanish and French so that the field could review and provide inputs to the first draft. Then we revised it, did the translations, did a second review by all of these actors, and then finally did a field testing to make sure that we had really hit all of the points that we needed to. The field testing took place in 5 countries. Only one was an ECB agency because we wanted to have a fresh look at it and see how people found it who had not been part of the process. So that is a snapshot of what it took over those 2 years to develop this guide. Next slide, please. We organized the guide around 10 principles. Those 10 principles run through each of the chapters, each of the sections, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of these principles. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right, so many of these principles are very much in keeping with the Hilleboe framework, the 5 priorities for action, and we thought to provide illustrative examples for each of these, how they would look in a field program, and then in each chapter there's a case study. I'll tell you a bit more about that to really describe how the principles look. So we wanted to be sure people pay attention to all of these 10 principles and not separate them out, but include them as a group of principles. So increasing the understanding of the hazards and in the climate change context. So in understanding both that together and projecting forward, not just looking at historical patterns for hazards. Increasing understanding of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. And that includes, again, an analysis of the climate change, the situation currently observed, and potential changes in the future, and to look at among the stakeholders at all levels of vulnerability, capacity, and exposure to understand the full picture. Next slide, please. Recognizing rights and responsibilities, understanding that governance systems and political environment need to enable at-risk populations and be accountable for decisions, actions, and omissions. And also the role of other stakeholders, including NGOs, that should be complementary to and enabling of the relationship between duty bearers and right holders. We want to consider the strengthening participation of and the action by populations at risk. Keeping in the forefront of our planning is that all people at risk have a right to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. They have the firsthand knowledge of the issues that's affecting them and what kinds of things will help to reduce their disaster risks. It also, engaging the population, the participation also shows evidence of building strategies that show ownership and sustainability, and looking to be sure that populations at risk, including the men, women, and children, are included in discussions. Next slide, please. Promoting systemic engagement and change. The goal of multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder engagement should be to make disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation central to development planning, so that it really is, this is getting it into planning and longer-term programming perspectives. Fostering synergy between multiple levels. That's, again, speaking to enabling environments, including the political and government levels, and actions taken at household and community levels. Drawing on and building diverse sources of knowledge. This is an analysis of disaster and climate risk should seek to complement local and traditional knowledge, and also to include scientific and research information as applicable. Next slide, please. Instilling flexibility and responsiveness. This is really key to so much of our work, because we may be doing, the activities may be interrupted and changed by an event, and we have to be ready to make a change and respond to the situation and accommodate new inputs. Addressing different timescales, analysis strategies and programs need to address current identified risks and also future scenarios. And then finally, do no harm. Processes to define strategies and programs to build resilience should incorporate an assessment of potential negative impacts, and including contributions to conflicts and effects on environment. In cases where potential harm is identified, measured to substantially reduce or remove these issues, these possible problems, should be built into the strategy and the program design. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the background on how the guide was developed and the foundation of the guide through the 10 principles. So what's in the guide? It's an introductory information, though I think it's useful also for people who have a background on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. But keep in mind that it is a guide. It's not a how-to step-by-step manual. So it does provide some practice guidelines and in different sectors and contexts and key groups to focus on, and also a section on the project management cycle. There are 17 case studies in the guide and 154 links to useful tools and resources. It also contains a glossary as well as an index. Next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of the contents. Again, the content of the guide was determined by the ECB field staff. It just went away. By the ECB staff at the summit meeting, and then revised through the various review processes. So these are the areas that they chose as most important for their work. These are the things that they find are part of the project design and implementation that they do. So it's an basic understanding of DRR and CCA. The key groups they selected were children, women and men, high-risk groups, and then a checklist for participation of these key groups. The program cycle management, and that's analysis, design, and implementation. The key sectors selected for the guide were food security, livelihoods, natural resource management, WASH, education, health, and protection. And then the contexts that we wanted to look at: conflict, early warning, early recovery from a humanitarian crisis, urban settings, and slow onset disasters. Next slide, please. This is an example of the principles and how they look in each section. This is just to where we laid out on the left-hand column the principles themselves, and then what you might do to uphold these principles for each of the sectors in the guide. Next slide, please. We provided good practice examples through case studies and frequently asked questions, and also some examples of what you might include in programming. For example, in box 2.2, what you might do to ensure that you're upholding good practices in your project. Next slide, please. Then here's an example of one of the case studies. We tried to keep them concise, which was not easy. We wanted to have them illustrate the section that they're included in, and also to demonstrate the principles. It was difficult to get case studies because I find case studies are not, they're very difficult to pull together and have them meaningful. The other question that comes up is that the group did want to have case studies from other agencies included in the guide. However, we ran into difficulties with this because to get case studies from other agencies, through other experiences, we really needed to have a fairly well-crafted, almost final guide so people could see where what kind of document their case studies would be included in. And since the guide was evolving due to the participatory process through the whole time frame, that became quite difficult. So we don't have as many examples from other agencies as we had hoped. Next slide, please. The resources and tools. We put together, these are the resources and tools relate to each section. We did a thorough search on what people find to be the best resources, and that went well beyond the ECB agencies, what people are using, and to try to get the most up-to-date and recent resources. Always tricky because things are coming out every day, but we wanted to make a shortcut for people who are struggling to find information that's most useful for their work, because it can be quite overwhelming by just doing searches. So we have a brief description of the tool, and then on the online version, the links are live, so you can just go straight through that link or copy and paste it into your browser to get to the link. This is one of the things that many people have already said that they really appreciate about the guide, because it's a real time saver for their needs. So that's what the guide looks like. Next slide, please. That's the end of the presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Amy, thank you so much. That was really excellent, and I'm glad to see that we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Some of you have already submitted questions through the chat or the Q&A function, and I'd like to encourage anyone who has a question to go ahead and submit that as soon as you can. We have a number of questions queued up, so Amy, if you don't mind, I'm going to throw them at you. We've got more than 40 people on the line. The first question I want to get to is Jackie Miller's question, and that question was, in light of Tohoku and patterns of natural disasters in the U.S., for example, Katrina and Sandy, have you begun to consider an approach to responding to disasters in developed countries, especially around climate change and high-risk groups?
Thank you for that question. Because this particular guide at this point in time is the agencies that were working on developing the guide and the representatives that were focused on the guide, particularly through the ECB project, are focused on developing countries. So that is the target for this particular guide. I think there are certainly some components of it that would be useful for other countries, for developed countries, but the intention for this particular guide was to focus on the countries in which the ECB agencies work, and primarily that's the developing countries.
Understood. Great. Second question, is DRR doing an online course on the guide? We had much discussion about this, and we did decide that we wanted to be sure to develop a guide that could be used without any kind of particular training, that you can pick it up and it will be helpful, that you don't need to be trained in its use. However, people do like to have an introduction. They like to listen to some of the examples, and so we are in the process of developing a module, not a training as such, but to help people become acquainted with the guide. We haven't looked into the context or the format yet. We're really beginning the discussions on this, but it will be available to help people, just sort of an overview and maybe some of the key points,
so that they can get excited about the guide and maybe have an introduction to it before they really start working with it.
Thanks for that, Amy. And just let me add that, in fact, the Disaster Ready Initiative is in consultation with a number of folks from the ECB around developing just that sort of an online, I'd say, complementary resource. But it's still early days there, and one of the things we really hope to do, and this ties in well with the question we just received, is we want to wait for a bit more feedback since the guide itself is quite new, as Amy said. We're going to want to see how people are using it, where questions tend to pop up, what sort of trends we see in terms of the feedback that comes back in. So with that, let me ask you that question, Amy. What sort of feedback, although it is early days, have you received on the guide already?
We have received some feedback since the guide was actually published in January, and it's been pretty much disseminated throughout the ECB agencies and to other groups now. We've received feedback that people particularly seem to like it. They think it will be useful. And specifically, we have asked the ECB agencies, the field programs, we're going to ask them to report back in June after they've had the guide in their hands for a couple of months to see what kinds of things are most useful to them and what kinds of things they may be struggling to understand, or if there would be areas that we would like to emphasize in the online accompaniment so that it would really meet their needs. So that's up to the use.
Excellent.
Okay.
Okay. The next question that came in is one that we often get when there's a guide released into the wild of the humanitarian community, and that is, are there plans to translate the guide into languages besides French and Spanish, and what would be the time frame for those?
The guide is currently being translated into Bahasa for Indonesia. We expect that China, the Mercy Corps group in China, is moving forward to translate it into Chinese, and there are other discussions about translating into other languages. It's just sort of, as with the Good Enough guide, it was a spontaneous, it wasn't a centrally managed process. It was on an as-needed basis, and what we did with that, when there was a request from a country to translate it, we helped to look for funding when it was needed. And one of the things we need to be careful of, but it wasn't a major issue with the Good Enough guide, is the quality of the translations, but working with the people in the countries to identify good translators and manage the quality. So I expect it will just evolve.
Understood. And I think, as we all saw with the Sphere initiative, that quality of translation issue was always present. And I just wonder if there's an agency out there that wants to spearhead the translation of the guide into a particular language. As you said, Mercy Corps is thinking of doing in China. Who should they get in touch with? Is it you or the ECB Secretariat? How would that work?
Yeah, at this point it would be ECB Secretariat, and then they can help us to manage the process. As it is an ECB product, I think that would be best.
Understood. Great. So a related question was, is the guide available online? And I think you mentioned it is. It would be at the ECB website. Is that right, Amy? Excellent. Okay. So
you can go to it now, and that's because you can buy we have the information of where to purchase the hard copies in English, French, and Spanish, and then you can download it from the ECB website and several other websites as well.
Great. Okay, here's our next question, and this is an interesting one. You noted that many of the staff working in DRR and CAA are not trained in those fields. I am a community vulnerability specialist interested in development planning, so my question is, are there institutional shifts on the horizon in recognition of the fact that DRR and CAA professionals offer a set of skills and knowledge that is required for successful development project execution? So both a question and I'd say a plug, but how do you feel about that, Amy? Is there a shift, institutional shift on the horizon that would bring greater recognition to the fact that these are discrete, important skills?
That's a really good question. I think, just sort of, there are some courses, there are some ways to gain some training in DRR. I think climate change adaptation tends to have probably a stronger institutional shift in that it's a lot of, very often, natural resource management people, agriculture specialists who are looking at changing practices and seed varieties and some of those kind of adaptive practices. I think slowly, but it is not as as pronounced as I think it would be. It would be very interesting to see more institutional shift toward providing training opportunities that really help people to look at a disaster risk reduction perspective, to have a forward thinking in our development programs, to really plan and prepare for disasters.
Understood. In fact, there's a related question we just got in that I think touches on this, and that is talking about how is the community's understanding, awareness, and appreciation for DRR and CAA practices, how is that evolving? And the question we got in was, what's the current state of awareness and support for DRR and CAA among donors, and then also amongst humanitarian agencies, but maybe focusing on donors first?
Okay, there definitely is a lot of talk in terms of donor shift. I think European ECHO donors, the EU, they're probably a bit more forward-thinking than some of the U.S. donors, public donors, and in supporting DRR and CCA. We are continually faced with the difficulty of demonstrating, especially through numbers and through budget figures, what kind of savings we're finding, saving lives and dollars in recovery efforts through DRR interventions. And there are, some sort of attempts to demonstrate this in a number of ways. World Bank has done some work, and agencies have done some work on their own. But again, it's we're trying to demonstrate what didn't happen, and so that's a bit tricky. But I think there's sort of a general much stronger. I've been working as a DRR advisor for 6 years, and it's much stronger now than it was even 6 years ago. And it just is. It's sort of pretty clear that if we do prepare for disasters to mitigate the impacts, and it's going to be helpful. It's important. The climate change adaptation piece is getting much stronger as we're seeing changes in climate, the storm patterns and rainfall, everything that's impacting livelihoods and lives. And so it's definitely coming much more to the surface. And in development programs, it used to be much more, DRR used to sort of come about on the heels of a disaster, the building back better approach. But we are seeing much more in terms of support for preparing for disasters in disaster-prone areas. Okay, that was that.
Yep. No, thank you for that. Next question. I think a lot of folks on the call know that ECB is at a bit of a transition moment in its existence. So the question is, what do you believe will happen post-ECB in terms of leadership within the community on DRR and CAA topics?
That's an excellent question. The ECB project is meant to end in August 2013. And there is discussion about a next phase of ECB. This is actually the second phase. The first phase was 3.5 years. And just what that might look like, what level of donor interest there might be, that's still under discussion. From my perspective, the DRR advisors who worked on, those of us who worked on the guide, it was a very, we really worked very closely, and we have had discussions about what kinds of things we might want to work on after ECB. Nothing terribly concrete yet, but there is interest, and many of the U.S.-based advisors participate in the Interaction DR working group, and I think that's a good avenue for us to continue to share our experiences and move forward more collectively. Of late, I've seen that particular group looking for as being a nice place to request resources, look for information, see if people have been have experience in this or whatever, and a good place for exchange. So I hope that we all are able to continue to contribute and participate in that group. That was a plug for that group.
Okay, duly noted. Thanks for that. We've got 2 more questions. Again, if anyone on the call has a question they'd like to submit, now's a great time to do so, either through your chat function or the Q&A function on your screens. But the 2 questions we have queued up, I'll just throw you the first one now, and that is, what were some of the benefits and challenges of developing the guide through a participatory process?
We actually did a lessons learned document about on the process, and the benefits noted were the people, the field staff particularly, from the ECB consortia, felt that it really enriched the process, that they learned through the process, and they felt that their contributions were definitely recognized in the book, and that we had a broader experience through that. There were things like, for example, the land use management question and some of the questions around that came up quite late in the review process, but and there were a number of things that came up quite late in the development of the guide. But we really felt they were important to incorporate or modify, and those involved in the process recognized that. They saw how their input really shaped the guide and really appreciated that. I think definitely the editorial committee brought a lot to the process and a lot of insights, and I think just working as a community to develop the guide, those were the kinds of things that were noted as very, very helpful and positive. The challenges were, I mean, you can just imagine how the review process, the 1,700 comments, the timing, and trying to make sure that the translations were done when the field had on their calendar to do the review, and to get the comments on time, and to try and get the comments in somewhat of a standardized way so that we could compare the information. And then when you get that many people involved, there are just a lot of things that come up that you didn't expect, and not very few conflicts. That was the group was really, I think everybody was so excited about the guide and so committed to it that there were only, the discussion about should it be in U.S. or U.K. English, those sorts of things. Some people took a pretty strong position on, but the management of it was challenging. But I think it was overall a very good experience.
Great, thank you. I can only imagine what you and the management group must have had to go through. So we have another question up now, and that question is, Amy, can you comment on the decision to include the word resilience in the title, and how the global thinking on resilience influenced the creation of the guide, and or how resilience thinking is reflected in the guide?
Okay, so initially we talked about this, the sort of draft title was The Practitioner's Guide to Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Adaptation. And really through a combination of the development of the guide and where the text was sort of taking people in the design of DRR and CCA programs, and the increased discussions of resilience. Over the because of the length of time that the guide, well, actually it was, if you really want to start at the beginning, it was almost 4 years, but the main work on it over the 2-year period, resilience did come up, obviously has become quite a big word in our work world, and we did think that what we are looking at is building more resilient communities, working from a more comprehensive perspective than just reducing risks to disasters and climate change adaptation. That it would really capture more comprehensively what the guide is seeking to assist staff to accomplish with the communities they work with. So that's it. We put it up for discussion and votes and things among the key players, and that's what we came up with. That's what the one that people.
Right. Understood. Hard to avoid that term these days, it seems. All right, so we've got, I believe, one last question, and that's actually great. We'll have this question, and then we'll wrap up. The last question, which is almost unavoidable, is: are funding patterns shifting in favor of DRR and CAA programming and approaches, or is this just being treated as the latest fad in relief and development?
Well, I mean, it's not as much as we're not seeing as much of a shift as I would like to see. I think that with funding levels decreasing, it's slow to change. I don't know what other agencies are seeing. We're working to encourage an investment in DRR and CCA. We're seeing it with some donors and less with others. I think some private donors are maybe more inclined to take this on than public donors, maybe because of the different demands for their funding. There's no shortage of need, and there's definitely some more thinking along these lines, and hopefully a much greater increase in funding availability will follow. And as I said, compared to 6 years ago, it's better.
Agreed. And I certainly hope, as do many folks, that the publication and the dissemination of this guide will help to move the needle a bit more in that direction as well. So with that, I'd like to bring us to a close. We've had some excellent questions. Thank you all for submitting those, and especially
George?
Amy. Thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Before you do that, could I just? It looked like this photo is actually a climate change rally in Bangladesh. Could you go to the next slide? There's one final one. So this is where you can get the guide and download and hard copies. And I'd like to thank the donors, OFDA, ECHO, Gates Foundation, and Fidelity. And OFDA and ECHO, being very involved in this type of programming, have both expressed that they're happy with the guide. So I'm really happy about that.
Understood. No, that's an excellent sign, and I think we're all looking forward to seeing the feedback that comes back in from practitioners and people in the field on the guide, and what it hits particularly well, and maybe where there's room for further work. That I'm sure that'll be very interesting for the ECB team as well. So, Amy, I was about to thank you and wrap up. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Well, Amy, thank you seriously for taking the time to meet with us today and to presenting this resource in greater detail. Very much appreciate you doing that. Thank you to all of you who have attended today. And I just want to mention that a recording of this session, for those of you who might want to listen again or would like to share it with colleagues who couldn't be with us today, will be available on the disasterready.org portal in about 2 days' time. So by the end of the day, Thursday, you should find it up on the welcome page of disasterready.org. And finally, I'd just like to say that we look forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar. That webinar will take place on the 7th of May, and that'll be with Veronica Faubert of the SPHERE project team. Veronica will be walking us through the new SPHERE Handbook in Action e-learning course that many of you have probably already heard of. And we have an excellent opportunity to hear from Veronica, who is really the producer of that course, and ask her any questions that. Again, 7th of May, and that'll be at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central Europe time. So with that, I would just like to again thank you, Amy, and also Rahman and Jeanette for helping us with today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you all again in May. Take care, everybody.